Hey, welcome back to the Ask Brian Boggs show. For those of you who haven't seen past issues or episodes, you can check us out on YouTube, check us out on iTunes, and if you want to go to if you want to go to chairmakers.com, all of the prior issues or episodes are written out, transcribed, and Kevin's done a really good job with that, so check that out as well. So glad to have you with us this afternoon, and we've had some interesting questions come in, and as always, the question is asking one specific thing, but really opens up a much larger can of worms about issues in the life of woodworkers. So the first one I want to talk about came in from Martin Goebel, and if you all don't know who Martin Goebel is, check out Goebel and Company Furniture. They do some really interesting stuff up there in St. Louis, Missouri, and it's good to have Martin paying attention to us. So Martin asks, can Brian explain this technique on glueless chairs where he hyperdries legs and assembles before the swell? Actually, it's the rungs. Is this a typo? It's the rungs that are hyper dry. Anyway, I got my start building Greenwood chairs and learned that technique basically through John Alexander's book, Make a Chair from a Tree. The idea of a Greenwood chair is that you're taking a log apart and putting it back together using the tree's movement, moisture properties, and the way wood behaves to actually hold the piece together rather than using adhesives to hold it together. And one of the things that has been great about that as my beginning is that it has really thoroughly shown me the way wood behaves. And when you're splitting wood out by hand like I was at the time, it was real easy to physically get a feel for the material, and seeing the fibers separate, it gave me an understanding that I don't think can be had in another way. So that was a really important part of that era, and it still feeds just about everything I do in the shop now. But back to how that works, you're splitting the wood apart and generally working with it green, and the greener the better from the standpoint of working with the wood, because it's a lot softer and easy to work then, and it makes the hand tool work a lot faster. Another thing about riving stock out, which is how I did this certainly in the beginning, is that when you're splitting wood from the log, you're getting wood whose fibers are completely intact, meaning that that particular stick of wood is as strong a part as that tree has to offer. You go beyond that by selecting the right trees, the right species to best suit the demands that that particular part has, and then you control the drying process for the same reason. You're wanting to best utilize the wood's properties and best utilize the wood's behavior to strengthen the frame that you're creating. And while that level of working with wood's behavior is unique to Greenwood working and Greenwood chair making, and I know Peter Follansbee does a 17th century joinery that actually uses rectangular parts with this similar thinking in terms of being able to efficiently work with greener wood. But what we're doing in making Greenwood chairs is the legs are not totally green, but partly dried. And I like about 15 to 18% as an ideal moisture content for the legs at assembly time, or at the time that you're drilling holes to receive the rungs. The rungs there's a couple of ways to deal with the rungs, but basically at the time that they are the right size and assembled, those rungs should be around 4% moisture content. What happens is that the rungs, the rung goes inside the leg, and there's a ring cut around the tenon of the rung that's inside the leg, and the leg shrinks into that ring and clamps down on the rung, and it never comes apart. It really can't come apart mechanically. It's a joint that has mechanics that I don't believe is possible without the deformation of green wood post-assembly. And that's a really unique thing about that. One of the things that John Alexander did not cover in that book, though, is the importance of working with specific species. Well, actually, he did talk about that some. He uses hickory for the rungs. But I got to really like soft maple for the legs. And the reason is that soft maple's ability to deform is really great. It not only can deform really well into the notch of that rung, but the behavior of soft maple is such that it'll deform into a shape and hold that shape, and as the rung swells, it's less likely to crack than some other woods. But also, it will tend to follow that rung. So as the rung shrinks or swells, the resilience of that maple, the particular resilience, which is not like hickory, which is extremely resilient, but hickory doesn't give much. Maple has a give to it and a return to its original shape, which is the resilience, that allows it to hold on to a hickory rung really tightly, I think better than just about any wood we've got. Even though hickory is a stronger wood for a leg, or oak is a stronger wood for a leg, the issue with keeping a chair together is not just about, in fact, I think it's less about the strength of the individual parts, but it's the ability of a joint to stay tight over time and under stress. So that whole process I think it's a really good one to go through and to learn, because of what it will teach you in going through that about all the things that we do in woodworking. So even though the furniture that I'm making now is not so much about the wood's movement after assembly, we've certainly taken into consideration the wood's grain orientation and its behavior after assembly in the way that we take any particular part out of a tree. And I use that language because we actually buy logs. And this kind of rolls into already some other questions that are on the list, which I'll pick out in a minute. But basically, whether you're working with a Greenwood chair making, Windsor chair making, 17th century furniture, or contemporary furniture, it's really important to pay attention to a given part's orientation in the tree, or its orientation to the medullary rays and growth rings, because it impacts how that piece is going to move. The other thing that it's really important to pay attention to throughout the process of managing your lumber pile and working with your wood is what the specific moisture content is of every part that you're working with. Now, sometimes, if you really get a good sense of working with differential moisture contents, you can learn how to make judgment calls as to exactly what an okay moisture content is for a given part. It's safer to go with 7-8% at assembly time for everything, but knowing whatever the ideal moisture content is for what you're putting together today, it's really important to know exactly what that moisture content is, and you can't do that really well without a good moisture meter. And when I was making Greenwood chairs early on, I didn't have a meter. I used other methods which were much less effective, and I saw that later as some of the chairs got loose because the rungs were not initially dry enough, or that unbeknownst to me, the legs might have been too wet as well. Again, the reason you want that moisture content in the leg to be around 15 to 18%, not 20-25%, because at 15 to 18%, there's plenty of movement that leg is going to make to tighten down on that rung without having the excess moisture that can cause too much swelling in the rung, which can compress and damage the joint beyond the movement that you want to get that structural tightness and strength in the joint. So if you're not interested in making Greenwood chairs at any point, I think it's worth looking at the history of that and the process of that, because particularly John Alexander's book, Pete Galbert also has a fairly new book called Chair Notes, and He talks about this as well. Drew Langsner, has had a book out. I don't think it's in print anymore, but Chairmaker's Workshop. All of those talk about, and Bruce Hoadley's book, Understanding Wood, all talk about grain orientation, and it's important to the mechanics and longevity of any given joint, whether we're relying on a glue bond to stay tight or we're just asking the wood itself to behave in such a way that the joint stays tight. All of it is, with all the furniture that we make, is really critical in having the work that we do stay the way we intended it to stay. We keep moisture meters going all day long. We've got one in the shop, and there is not a day that goes by that one of us isn't using that moisture meter. We track our wood. Just because it was kiln dried and at one point it was 7% does not mean that it's ready to cut a joint in. It might have picked up moisture. It might need to go in the hot room to dry out a little bit more. But we need to know, and I think you need to know, what the moisture content of the wood that you buy. One of the things that we've run into issues with, and I think my Greenwood chairmaking history has really fed my alertness and attentiveness to moisture content. But whenever I buy wood from a retailer, I never trust that to be dry. I don't want to put the longevity of my wood in anybody else's hands. So I always check the moisture content of wood. And very often, in fact, I haven't had a supplier yet provide us with wood that at least at one time or other did not arrive at way too high a moisture content to be usable at that time. So we get readings of up to 15% sometimes in kiln dried wood. So it's certainly something to be aware of. Bill wrote in, I assume you use wide boards for many of your projects. How do you prevent wide boards from warping? I realize selection is important, but are there any other ways to prevent warpage? Well, there are, Bill. There's a lot of ways to prevent warpage, but you're absolutely right that selection is critical. And the selection for us, for the most part, happens at the log yard. And we look at the grain in the bark and look for logs that don't have much medullary twist. Most trees will have a certain amount of wind, which means that their grain doesn't go in a straight line from the ground to the branches. It goes in a slight spiral. And it's usually a right-hand screw on this side of the equator. Below the equator, I think it's a left-hand screw, but basically the grain will spiral downward. And the more it spirals, the more twist and warp you're going to get in the wood. So that's one way to avoid some problems. In cherry lumber, it's nearly impossible to see that. Good reason for buying logs instead of lumber. Walnut, oak, and more coarse grain woods you can usually see on the edge of a flat sawn board or on the face of a quarter sawn board. Well, on the edge of quarter sawn boards too, you can see the grain direction. So look at the boards carefully and try to avoid ones that have wind in the grain. That'll do you a lot of good. If you're drying your own wood, you want to dry it slowly, of course, and keep it weighted. That will help eliminate some of the stress that will cause boards to warp later. But boards are always going to try to warp. Depending on the moisture content, they're either swelling up or shrinking, and they're going to be doing this or this, frowning or smiling from the in view. And you've just got to bolt them down. You've got to bolt the boards down to a cross member. And whether it's a trestle table or a four-legged table, you've got to have a secure enough bond there to keep that wood from lifting off the frame, and enough of a movement allowance in the screw attachment so that the wood can travel laterally as it shrinks and swells. But you can't prevent wood from moving. You can slow its movement down with a lot of finish. But one of the ways that I have actually enjoyed recently to just about eliminate movement, shrinkage, warping, and cracking is to do what we call an engineered top, and that's to use a thick birch ply core and bandsawn veneer over that. That gives you the beauty and integrity of a solid wood top and the stability of plywood, and it's in my view, a great solution. It also opens up options for designing table bases and other pieces of furniture where solid wood demands a mechanical and structural way of keeping boards within the piece of furniture flat. And traditional furniture has always had to address this. Engineered panels, whether it's a tabletop or a cabinet side, with ply-core and bandsaw veneer face, pretty much eliminate that issue and open up cleaner design options. I say cleaner, meaning that you don't have parts in there whose role is simply to maintain the flatness of the top. That job is taken care of internally within any of the panels. Oops, somebody's calling in. Sorry about that. Let's see, how much time, how are we doing with time here? Is that it?
We started late.
Oh, okay, we started late, okay. So we have another one here on sticker stain. I'm having trouble, John Murphy wrote in, I'm having trouble with sticker stain on all white woods and the sapwoods of cherry and walnut. Is there an easy way to prevent this remedy, or is there any way to prevent this or remedy it after the fact? Yes to both. The way that we prevent it in white woods is, as much as possible, try to buy the logs in the wintertime, saw them as soon as possible after they're cut, or if you have to buy one in the summertime, you want it to be sawn into lumber as soon after the tree is felled as is possible. And as soon as it's cut at the mill, you want to lean the boards up against the building, or if you can't do that, you can sticker them with stickers only at the end, with no stickers contacting the surface of the boards, until the surface has several days up to a week to dry off. Once the surface of the boards has dried off, you can put dry sticks and then sticker the lumber as usual. And that does a lot to prevent any kind of staining. After the fact, while we try as much as possible to buy all of our wood in log form so that we can control issues like this, there are times when we have to buy wood that, because our wood's not ready yet or we don't have any, and we'll buy maple or ash and it'll have sticker stain. We have had pretty good luck with all of the white woods, not so much poplar, but ash and maple. We've had good luck using a part A and part B stain. This is hydrogen peroxide and sodium hydroxide. They're really nasty chemicals. I don't like using things like that. I much prefer to prevent this. But given sticker stain, and this is an enzymatic stain, it's very often not, it can become actually a fungal infestation, but initially the stain is an enzymatic stain. It's a chemical change that can be aesthetically at least reversed with the hydrogen peroxide, sodium hydroxide's 2-part bleach. You'll want to read the instructions carefully on that. And I know our local asphalt hardware carries it. I don't know who will carry it in your area, but just Google it or ask around for a part A, part B bleach and with those chemicals, and read all the precautions. This is nasty stuff. And once you read the precautions, you'll start working on the prevention end of this so you don't have to deal with these chemicals. So that takes care of those two things. And with cherry and walnut, if you've got sticker stain in the sapwood, you can try locally bleaching or bleaching the full line of sapwood on that board, but you can't really do a spot bleaching of sapwood without having a differential in color right around where you've bleached. So, a question has come in.
Yes, we got a couple of questions. First question is, don't know how to say his name, but it's RLFD141, asks, I have a large walnut tree I will be dropping next week. Would I be better off busting out parts or part size pieces green, or trying to store the log?
Well, it's the wrong time of year to try to store a log. Walnut, heartwood is pretty resilient to decay, but the sapwood is not. Now, there's a couple of things you can do. One is you can split the parts out now, and if it takes a long time to get to them, they're just stacked, they're going to dry out and be a lot harder to work. So you lose that advantage in terms of the working efficiency with hand tools. Another option is you can split the parts out, leave them a couple inches extra long, and you can leave them oversized just into manageable portions for handling. But you can store them underwater. If you can get a tank, or if you've got some kind of wooden box or something, you can fill trash bags with water. You can store these sticks underwater, not just wet, but they actually want to be completely submerged. Submerging them in water does two things. One, they'll hold their moisture content. They won't crack at all. They won't warp, except from the stress in the tree. If the tree was leaning, they might warp anyway. But also, once you start working with them, the wood will dry out much more readily without cracking. And walnut is one that can be tricky to dry. I don't really understand why soaking wood makes it easier to dry. It's a little bit counterintuitive. But I used to experiment with this years ago when I was trying to store Greenwood, the same reason you're considering it, because I had more wood than I could finish working with, and I didn't want it to dry out. I just bought stock tanks from a local farm store and stored them under that. You'll want to change the water at probably once a week, because you'll start growing anaerobic bacteria and it starts to smell like a hog pen. So you don't want that. But soaking it is a great way to store it, and it'll be much easier to dry once you do pull it out.
So I have one from Andrew Gieselman.
Oh, hey. Andrew is a good friend of ours, a woodworking student up in near Missouri, up in St. Louis area.
How thick do you resaw wood for surface or composite panels?
Well, the thickness that we resaw is one thing. The thickness that we dress it to is another. So the thickness to resaw something has partly to do with how well you can control your cut on the bandsaw. You want to allow for whatever variance your blade wander is going to cause. But we generally saw about 20 thousandths oversized, and that's enough for our saw. And we'll leave a tabletop about an 1/8 inch thick, a tabletop veneer about an 1/8 of an inch thick. For other panels, 1/16 of an inch is fine, like the side of a desk or something that doesn't get a lot of wear and tear. The reason for going with thinner isn't just yield, but it has to do with wood movement. It's preferable from a stability standpoint to go with a thinner veneer, thinner than an 1/8 of an inch, because the thicker the veneer, the more it tries to act like solid wood. We want it to look like solid wood, but we don't want it to push and pull one side of the plywood, causing warpage. So whatever the thickness is, you want to balance the same amount on both sides of the plywood so that they'll push and pull equally. You also want, if you're using two species, you want similar grain orientation and similar movement. Different woods move different amounts, so you don't want to go with something like a quarter sawn white pine on one side and a flat sawn walnut on the other. That's an extreme, but the idea is you want compatible movement and force on both sides of your core. So it's more important than you do the same thing on both sides. And also, you've got to, you've got to be able to dimension your material down to a certain size. So if you don't have a thickness sander, you're limited to what your planer can do. We've actually been able to greatly increase or decrease our minimum thickness through the planer by making a vacuum box that sits on the planer bed, and we just put slots in the top of the box. This is a plywood box that we make. This is a 3-inch thick plywood box, and we hook a vacuum to the bottom of it, and there are 1/4-inch slots in the top of it that are right under the cutter head, so that the shop vac attached to it will hold the veneer down under the cutter head. And we've been able to actually thickness plane, 35 thousandths of an inch thick veneers in our 24-inch planer. That's a helical head. I don't know if you could do that with a straight knife cutter, but that's one thing you can experiment with for getting your thickness down uniform and thinner than the typical 1/8 inch minimum that planers can do.
All right, so I have a question from FJ Test. All right, I'm not even going to say it. So FJTESTUDANTEEAT. And the question is, there is a wood called Pequi or Pequi.
Don't know Pequi.
I think that's how you say it. The name of wood, it doesn't burn, and we have it. Is there something similar in the United States? I don't know if they could ask, maybe.
Where they are.
Oh, it doesn't become ash, is what he's saying. Would love to know where you're at.
Yeah, I don't know. If somebody's got a response to this one, I am stumped.
I have another question here from Rusty Checkerniss. Are you planning on teaching more chair making classes?
Am I teaching more chair making classes? I don't have plans for teaching hands-on classes like I used to. However, I have a great former student, Jeff Lefkowitz, who is teaching classes at his shop, and he has been getting actually better reviews than I ever got teaching classes. So Jeff's teaching my ladder back chairs, side chairs, armchairs, rocking chairs, and now bar stools in his shop. And he has a protege, David Duard, who has become an instructor. He's making chairs professionally and teaching on the side. And those are also, he's in Connecticut. So Jeff Lefkowitz is near Richmond, Virginia.
No, near Dulles Airport.
Near Dulles Airport? Okay. Jeff's near Dulles Airport. So anyway, they're on chairmaker.com. Go to chairmaker.com and you'll be able to get contact from both of these guys. And I recommend particularly Jeff, but also I think David would do a good job. So chairmakers.com? Okay. So yeah, I really wanted to put my focus from an instructional standpoint on training the employees that we have here. We have a growing team of fine craftsmen, and it's been a lot of fun working with them. But also there's a lot of new design development that I've really been enjoying, and teaching just wasn't really allowing me to do enough of that. So this is something in that direction, and we'll be doing videos and maybe someday a book that will help support spreading the understanding of chair making a little bit beyond where it is now. So that's a wrap. Folks, if you want to check out prior episodes, go to YouTube and look us up there. iTunes also has past episodes, and this one will be transcribed as well and will eventually show up on chairmakers.com. So glad to be with you again, and look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Thanks.